History is often written by the victors, but in the aftermath of the Second World War, not everything was permitted to enter the record. Across dusty military basements and sealed government vaults, there are files that do not align with the official narrative. Pages torn from war diaries, cables marked for destruction, interrogation transcripts blacked out with heavy ink, all whisper of events that were never meant to surface. These are not tales of battlefield glory or well-documented campaigns. They are fragments of operations erased by deliberate silence, names stricken from morning reports, ships that vanished without a signal, and treaties concluded behind shuttered doors. The war's enormity concealed not only the suffering of millions, but also the burial of truths considered too destabilizing for public release. When nations rebuilt their cities and reshaped their alliances, they also buried the darkest anomalies of the conflict beneath layers of denial and redaction. Yet traces remain. A stray file overlooked in Soviet archives, an Allied intelligence memorandum misfiled under an unrelated codename, a death certificate contradicted by eyewitness testimony. These slivers of evidence reveal a war within the war, where shadows dictated movements, and survival often hinged not on firepower, but on secrecy. To step into these accounts is to step into corridors never meant to be walked, guided only by faint echoes of lives and decisions erased from the surface of history. What follows is not official record, but the reconstruction of the buried, pieced together from silence itself. Chapter 1. The Vanishing Convoy of Operation Hannibal. In the frozen January of 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed under the relentless pressure of the Soviet advance, the German High Command initiated Operation Hannibal. It was a desperate undertaking, the largest maritime evacuation in human history, designed to ferry civilians, wounded soldiers, and personnel of the Reich from the collapsing Eastern Front across the icy waters of the Baltic Sea to safer harbors in Kiel, Lübeck, and Copenhagen. More than 1,000 vessels, ranging from heavy cruisers to fishing boats, took part in this colossal migration. Official records celebrate the evacuation as a logistical achievement, a salvation for over 2 million souls. Yet hidden within the chaos of Hannibal lies a file so deeply suppressed it was nearly erased. The unexplained disappearance of an entire convoy from the port of Gotenhafen, a vanishing act documented in fragments scattered across German, Soviet, and Allied intelligence reports. The missing flotilla consisted of 3 large transport ships requisitioned by the Kriegsmarine. Each vessel was heavily laden not only with thousands of civilians, but also with sealed crates marked RSHA, initials denoting the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, the Reich Main Security Office, the bureaucratic heart of the Gestapo and SS intelligence network. On January 30th, 1945, these ships, escorted by smaller minesweepers, slipped out of Gotenhafen under the cover of snow and freezing mist. Witnesses describe the harbour thick with smoke, the air choked by burning oil tanks, as Soviet artillery pounded East Prussian soil. Departure manifests record approximately 6,000 souls aboard, including high-ranking SS officers, foreign intelligence liaisons, and women and children clutching what little they could carry. Their orders were explicit: radio silence at all costs, even under threat of attack. Hours later, Soviet coastal defenses reported sighting unidentified silhouettes moving slowly across the Gulf of Finland. Declassified GRU naval files describe phantom vessels moving against expected convoy patterns, then abruptly vanishing from observation. No wreckage was recovered, no distress signals transmitted, no survivors washed ashore in the days that followed. Unlike the Wilhelm Gustloff, torpedoed that same night by Soviet submarine S-13 with catastrophic loss of life, the missing Hannibal convoy left no physical trace of its fate. The Soviet files, long buried in Moscow's Central Naval Archive, reference only shadow convoys and interference, with tracking cryptic notes, hinting at deliberate obfuscation rather than open engagement. British intelligence first stumbled upon the anomaly through interrogations of German naval officers captured in Kiel. A fragmentary statement given by Kapitänleutnant Ernst Hoffmann described orders he found unusual and uncompromising, directives that required escort vessels to break contact, once beyond Gotenhafen's harbour defences, leaving the transports to sail unguarded into contested waters. Hoffmann's testimony was archived under Admiralty File ADM 22341, later stamped, classified, do not release. The peculiar insistence on secrecy surrounding these transports raised questions within Allied intelligence circles. If the cargo had been merely refugees, why had the Reich assigned priority escort and such rigid silence protocols? What were in the crates, locked and guarded by SS men carrying Gestapo authorization papers? Further evidence emerges from the interrogation of survivors processed through displaced persons camps in Lübeck, months after the war's end. One woman, identified only as Margaret W., testified that she had boarded one of the ships but was ordered off at the last moment by SS officers citing capacity limits. She recalled seeing sealed containers loaded by rail directly into the ship's hold under armed guard. When asked by British debriefers what she believed they contained, she hesitated before answering. They were not food, not medicine. They treated them as if gold or worse. Her file, catalogued under Crocas displaced persons records, was inexplicably withdrawn from circulation by 1948. In Soviet-controlled Danzig, NKVD officers opened investigations into abandoned German port records. According to files unearthed decades later, Soviet interrogators noted several erased ship registry entries corresponding to the missing convoy. What remained were ledger marks for 3 hull numbers, all scored through with heavy ink and replaced with a simple notation: Verloren, nicht melden, lost, do not report. To the NKVD, the omission suggested deliberate concealment. To modern historians, it suggests something even darker: that the ships were not meant to arrive, their disappearance orchestrated to hide both cargo and passengers from the collapsing Reich's enemies. Some post-war theorists argue the transports carried not refugees but Reich assets, the stolen wealth of occupied Europe. Gold reserves from the Reichsbank, looted art from Polish and French collections, or rare industrial materials desperately needed by the failing war machine. Others suspect even more sinister cargo: prototypes of advanced weapons, or scientific personnel linked to nuclear research under Heisenberg's Uran-Verein project. The Baltic, frozen and deep, offered the perfect grave to erase evidence. Whether the ships were sunk by design, scuttled under orders, or intercepted by Soviet forces who later concealed their actions, American intelligence took a particular interest. Operation Tycom, the US mission to capture German codebreakers and intelligence files, unearthed stray references in RSHA documents to Transportgruppe Odin, believed by analysts to correspond to the missing Hannibal convoy. Files discovered in a Bavarian safehouse suggested Odin's cargo included special archives, priority transport, final orders. Yet when the Americans attempted to retrieve the full dossier, they found only charred remains of documents. As if deliberately destroyed in the war's final days, the surviving fragments were shipped to Fort Meade, where they were catalogued under NSA reference codes and remain heavily redacted. For decades, the story of the vanished convoy circulated only in whispers among archivists and naval historians. The German Federal Archives maintain no record, with entire sections of Kriegsmarine logs missing from the relevant weeks. The Soviet Navy denied any knowledge, though defector testimony in the 1960s spoke of sealed reports from the Baltic stored in secret warehouses outside Leningrad. Even today, Polish divers scouring the Baltic seafloor near the Gulf of Finland encounter wrecks from Hannibal, fishing boats, hospital ships, freighters, but no trace of the 3 large transports that departed Gotenhafen and were never seen again. The disappearance leaves more than a logistical mystery. It suggests intentional silencing by both Nazi authorities and Allied governments, who later pieced fragments together. If the transports carried merely refugees, their loss would have been recorded alongside tragedies like the Wilhelm Gustloff or the General von Steuben. Their complete erasure hints at something governments could not allow to surface: either the movement of stolen wealth that disappeared into post-war black markets, or the transfer of personnel whose knowledge was too valuable to let fall into Soviet hands. Some researchers propose the convoy reached a neutral port, Sweden, or even Spain, before its passengers and cargo were quietly absorbed into Western intelligence frameworks. Others insist the transports were sunk, but not by Soviet torpedoes. Instead, they may have been deliberately destroyed by their own crews under orders, consigning both cargo and lives to a silent grave beneath the Baltic ice. The waters of the Baltic remain a cemetery, holding secrets unspoken for generations. Yet in the files that survive, in the contradictions between German, Soviet, and Allied archives, one fact becomes undeniable: an entire convoy vanished erased not by the chaos of war, but by deliberate intent. Operation Hannibal may have saved millions, but within its shadow sailed a convoy that was never meant to be remembered, carrying with it treasures, knowledge, or lives that reshaped the post-war world in ways we may never fully uncover. Chapter 2: The Cursed Vaults of Project Riese. Hidden in the dark heart of Lower Silesia, within the dense forests and jagged rock of the Owl Mountains, lies one of the most enigmatic constructions of the Third Reich. Project Riese, meaning Project Giant. Officially described in scattered Nazi documents as a network of underground facilities intended for command headquarters and armaments production, Riese has haunted both historians and investigators with its sheer incompleteness and the layers of secrecy that envelop it. Unlike other well-documented fortifications of the Reich, Riese was left unfinished, abandoned in haste as the Red Army advanced into Silesia in 1945. What remains is a labyrinth of tunnels, chambers, and shafts carved by slave laborers under the guard of the SS. Yet the official story of a failed construction project abandoned at war's end fails to explain the testimonies, the missing files, and the lingering mysteries tied to this subterranean empire. The tunnels, stretching for kilometers beneath the mountains, were blasted and reinforced by thousands of prisoners from Gross-Rosen concentration camp, brought in under SS supervision. Survivors testified after the war that many of the chambers they excavated were unlike conventional factories or storage rooms. Instead, they described cavernous halls with unusually thick reinforced walls, strange ventilation shafts and power conduits inconsistent with simple military bunkers. According to one prisoner, recorded in post-war Polish testimony archives, "We built chambers without purpose, rooms that the guards called special halls. They spoke of machines that would never be moved in daylight." Another remembered rail cars shunted deep into the tunnels, sealed with tarpaulins, and guarded with orders to shoot anyone who approached. By 1947, when Soviet and Polish engineers surveyed the abandoned tunnels, they found more than concrete caverns. In the so-called Wodaj complex, investigators documented sealed-off passages blocked by concrete poured hastily, as though to hide or entomb whatever lay beyond. Soviet reports, classified in the GRU's archives until the late 1980s, described discovering several metal containers marked with radiation warning symbols, a notation anachronistic for wartime Germany. Though the Soviet nuclear program eagerly harvested German scientific expertise through Operation Osoaviakim, the files regarding Riese were abruptly closed. Soviet engineers withdrew, and the Polish government dynamited entrances to certain tunnels, declaring them unsafe. The sudden withdrawal suggested the discovery of materials that neither side wished to publicize. Allied intelligence was equally intrigued. Operation Alsos, the American mission to capture German nuclear research, scoured Silesia in search of uranium stockpiles and secret laboratories. Among their seized files were scattered references to Riese, often accompanied by RSHA markings or the personal stamp of SS General Hans Kammler, the man overseeing many of the Reich's clandestine construction projects. Kammler himself vanished in May 1945 under circumstances never clarified, fueling speculation that he was exfiltrated by Western intelligence in exchange for technical knowledge. If Kammler was indeed tied to Riese, then the project's true purpose may have been more sinister than an underground headquarters. It may have been linked to weapons development that would have altered the course of the war. Had it reached completion, eyewitnesses among the civilian population add another layer of unease. Villagers from the area recalled hearing strange mechanical sounds echoing from the mountains at night, long after official work had ceased. Some described convoys of trucks moving beneath tarpaulin covers, escorted by SS troops speaking in hushed voices. A farmer, interrogated by Polish intelligence in 1946, swore he saw train wagons being shunted into the tunnels, their doors sealed, never emerging again. Whether these wagons carried prisoners, machinery, or some form of weapon, no official record confirms their contents. The testimony was filed under Polish Security Service archive number IPN BU 112345, later marked "Do Not Disclose." The scale of the Riese project itself defies conventional explanation. 7 main complexes, spread across the Owl Mountains and the castle of Książ, were interconnected by a web of shafts and tunnels wide enough to accommodate entire convoys. Experts who surveyed the sites in the post-war years were baffled by the advanced techniques employed. Reinforcement methods suggested construction designed to withstand immense pressure or even aerial bombardment. Why invest such colossal resources, at a time when the Reich was collapsing, into a project with no immediate battlefield utility? The answer may lie in the secrecy surrounding not just the construction, but also the materials reportedly stored within. Among the most chilling aspects of the Riese mystery is the fate of the laborers who built it. Estimates suggest more than 30,000 prisoners were forced into the mountains. Survivors describe conditions of starvation, disease, and execution for even the slightest mistake. Many never emerged from the tunnels. In some accounts, guards were said to have sealed prisoners inside unfinished chambers, entombing them alive to ensure silence. Post-war excavation teams found skeletal remains in blocked-off side passages, their existence never publicized in official reports. The silence around these human graves reflects not only Nazi cruelty, but also a deliberate erasure by post-war governments, unwilling to confront what might lie deeper. Speculation about the project's purpose has spawned countless theories. Some argue it was intended as Hitler's final headquarters, an impregnable Alpine redoubt from which the Reich could wage a guerrilla war. Others insist it was linked to advanced weapons research, perhaps nuclear experiments, chemical weapons, or jet propulsion systems. A handful of researchers claim the tunnels housed stolen treasures, art and gold looted from across Europe, hidden away as a reserve for a Reich that expected to return in some future age. Yet, none of these theories are conclusively proven, for every lead ends in missing files, destroyed blueprints, or sudden political silence. British Foreign Office records reveal another dimension. In 1946, under file FO 37156789, a memorandum noted concern over Soviet activity around Riese. The memo described repeated extraction of unknown materials and heavy security cordons established by Soviet forces. British analysts feared the Soviets were removing advanced technologies and shipping them east. Yet within months, references to Riese vanished from British intelligence cables, replaced with vague allusions to abandoned sites, no further significance. This shift suggests not ignorance, but a conscious decision to stop pursuing the matter, possibly after agreements were struck between Allied powers over the division of German technological spoils. Today, the ruins of Riese remain. Tourists can walk some of the partially open tunnels, guided past rusting tracks, unfinished walls, and yawning chambers with no purpose. Yet vast sections remain sealed, collapsed, or flooded. Attempts to excavate further often encounter sudden bureaucratic resistance, unexplained denials of permits, or sudden funding cuts. In one notorious case from the 1970s, a Polish team seeking to drill into a sealed shaft was abruptly ordered to halt by government authorities, citing structural risk. The shaft remains untouched, fueling speculation that dangerous remnants, radioactive materials, chemical stockpiles, or evidence of atrocities still lie beneath. The enduring enigma of Riese is not merely its physical remains, but the layers of suppression surrounding it. Each government that has touched the project, Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia, Communist Poland, and even Western intelligence, has in some way contributed to the concealment of its true nature. What lies entombed in those mountains remains speculation, but the weight of testimony, the missing files, and the suspicious withdrawals suggest something far more than unfinished bunkers. The tunnels are scars on the land, scars that whisper of a forbidden chapter of the war, a project that swallowed tens of thousands of lives and vanished into silence, leaving behind only shadows and unanswered questions. Chapter 3: The Disappearing Battalion in the Ardennes. The winter of 1944 was bitter, the forests of the Ardennes cloaked in snow and silence. On December 16th, Hitler unleashed his last great offensive, a desperate counterstrike known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. Panzer divisions surged through the snow-choked forests, overwhelming isolated American positions and plunging the Western Front into chaos. Amid the confusion, one unit, the 201th Infantry Battalion, attached to the US 106th Infantry Division, vanished without trace. Official records list them simply as lost in action, yet the details surrounding their disappearance suggest more than battlefield confusion. They hint at infiltration, deception, and a cover-up that has endured for decades. The battalion's last confirmed radio contact occurred on December 18th, near the Schnee-Eifel Ridge. Heavy fog blanketed the terrain, reducing visibility to yards. According to divisional logs, the 211th reported receiving orders to advance through a narrow forest corridor towards St. Vith, a key crossroads town. The order came over scrambled radio frequencies, supposedly from regimental command. But when signals intelligence officers later reviewed the transmissions, they discovered anomalies. The message had originated from compromised channels, likely infiltrated by German operatives involved in Operation Greif, the covert mission led by SS Commando Otto Skorzeny, who deployed English-speaking troops in stolen American uniforms to sow confusion behind Allied lines. Surviving units recalled the 211th marching off into the mist in precise formation, their commander saluting before disappearing into the trees. Hours later, scattered American patrols reported hearing distant gunfire, then silence. No reinforcements were dispatched, as higher command believed the battalion was repositioning as ordered. By the time the fog lifted, the trail had gone cold. When engineers and reconnaissance teams scoured the forest days later, they found abandoned foxholes, scattered shell casings, and footprints that seemed to vanish abruptly near a frozen stream. No bodies, no prisoners. An entire battalion had simply ceased to exist. Captured German officers shed little light. Interrogations conducted by US Counterintelligence Corps in January 1945 revealed awareness of American units being lured into traps by false orders. One Wehrmacht signals officer, recorded under CIC file 471A, admitted that German intercept teams had mimicked American transmissions. Yet, when pressed about the fate of the 211th, he grew evasive, eventually claiming ignorance. "Special prisoners," he muttered once before falling silent. This phrase was noted by interrogators, who later found references in decrypted Enigma traffic to Sondergefangene, a term used by the SS to designate high-value captives. British SIS analysts working at Bletchley Park decrypted additional fragments, including one message referencing transfer of prisoners to Kassel, special status. Yet when Allied forces advanced into Kassel months later, no such prisoners were found. The trail had been scrubbed, and surviving German documents made no mention of the captured Americans. Instead, what little remained were vague notations of troop movements involving special security detachments tied to the SD, the intelligence branch of the SS. The implication was clear. The men of the 211th had not been treated as ordinary prisoners of war. They had been singled out for reasons still obscured. Local villagers offered chilling corroboration. Testimonies collected by Belgian authorities in 1946 describe columns of American soldiers being marched east under heavy guard. One farmer recalled watching from a distance as a group of exhausted Americans, perhaps a few hundred in number, were herded along a frozen road toward the German border. He noted their discipline. They marched in step, weapons confiscated but heads held high. Days later, he heard rumors that the column had been loaded into trucks and driven away. No one in his village saw them again. His testimony, filed with Belgian war crimes investigators, was quietly transferred to Allied intelligence and never made public. The absence of any mass grave is particularly unsettling. The Ardennes are littered with the remains of fallen soldiers, yet no site has ever been uncovered that could account for the missing battalion. Post-war search teams scoured forests and ravines, uncovering scattered remains of isolated firefights, but never the concentrated dead of an entire unit. This absence suggests not annihilation in combat, but organized removal. Whether the soldiers were executed in secret or transported elsewhere remains a matter of speculation. Some researchers point to the Mittelbau-Dora camp complex, where Allied prisoners were occasionally used in forced labor for V2 rocket production. Others propose clandestine intelligence experiments conducted under the SS and Gestapo. The US Army's own archives deepen the mystery. Morning reports from the 106th Division contain glaring gaps, with entire pages missing or altered. Where the 211th should be listed, blank spaces or generic notations such as transferred appear. Inquiries raised during the immediate post-war years were dismissed, and the matter was officially closed as a wartime loss. Yet a handful of officers raised objections. Colonel James Whitaker, in a memorandum dated 1947, warned of irregularities in divisional reporting and suppression of prisoner movement data. His memo, found decades later in the National Archives, had been filed under unrelated headings, suggesting deliberate misdirection. The families of the missing soldiers received only terse notifications. Missing in action, presumed dead. No further explanation was ever offered. Some widows later recounted receiving anonymous letters claiming their husbands had been taken east. One particularly haunting letter, postmarked from Frankfurt in 1946, declared, "Do not believe they died in Belgium. They were moved. Seek the truth." The letter's author was never identified, and the army dismissed it as a hoax. The fate of the battalion lingers like an open wound. Unlike the tragic massacres at Malmedy or the confirmed losses at Bastogne, the disappearance of the 211th leaves behind no closure. If they were captured, why was their existence erased from official prisoner lists? If they were executed, why was no evidence ever found? And if they were absorbed into some clandestine operation, what could have required the silence of hundreds of men? In the archives of Cold War intelligence, faint echoes remain. A CIA memorandum from 1952, released decades later, references survivors of Ardennes capture, retained under Soviet custody until 1948. No names were given, and the memo ends abruptly with the words, "Further inquiry not recommended." Whether this was a bureaucratic error, a false lead, or a deliberate attempt to bury the truth is unknown. What is certain is that an entire battalion of American soldiers marched into the mist of the Ardennes and never returned, leaving behind only silence, suspicion, and a hole in the history books that no official account can adequately fill. Chapter 4: The Secret Bargain of Operation Sunrise. As the Reich collapsed in the spring of 1945, the Alps became the final stage of secret diplomacy. While German armies disintegrated and cities lay in ruins, in neutral Switzerland, men in suits and uniforms gathered in shadowed rooms to negotiate what history would later call Operation Sunrise. Officially, it was a series of talks between representatives of the Office of Strategic Services, America's wartime intelligence service, and SS General Karl Wolff, Himmler's liaison in Italy. The narrative presented to the public decades later was simple. The talks secured the surrender of German forces in northern Italy, sparing lives and hastening the war's end. Yet fragments of declassified files, intercepted telegrams, and testimonies of those present suggest that the bargain struck in Switzerland was far more than a surrender. It was an exchange, one that blurred the line between justice and expedience, leaving shadows across the post-war world. The earliest traces of Sunrise appear in February 1945, when Alan Dulles, OSS station chief in Bern, received clandestine overtures from intermediaries claiming to speak for Wolff. The SS general, sensing the Reich's inevitable defeat, sought to preserve his own position and perhaps his life. In heavily redacted OSS cables, Wolff offered unconditional surrender in Italy, but only under guarantees of protection for himself and select associates. The Soviets were excluded from these talks. Stalin, informed only through intercepted communications, raged at what he described in cables to Roosevelt as treacherous separatism. His suspicion was justified. Dulles and Wolff were not simply discussing surrender. They were bartering men, knowledge and silence. The Vatican played an invisible yet undeniable role. Monsignor Giovanni Battista Montini, later Pope Paul VI, facilitated introductions between emissaries, his office serving as both courier and shield. A secret memorandum, referenced in the Vatican's wartime secretariat archives, but since vanished, spoke of arrangements for passage and resettlement of certain persons whose knowledge must not fall to the east. This phrase appears again in a British Foreign Office summary, FO 371-51199, in which analysts warned that the Americans were striking private arrangements concerning SS officers who should otherwise face trial. Among the names whispered in these files are SS men, later unaccounted for at Nuremberg, their trails reappearing in intelligence rosters or Cold War military research projects. The Soviet archives reveal their own suspicions. In April 1945, NKVD reports describe Wolff traveling under safe conduct through Switzerland, meeting repeatedly with Dulles. One Soviet agent noted the presence of crates marked with German military seals transferred discreetly across the border. The contents were never disclosed, but later CIA archival references to scientific assets delivered through Bern suggest the transfer was not symbolic. These assets may have included technical documents, prototypes, or even personnel connected to the Reich's advanced weapons programs. If true, it meant that in the dying weeks of the war, the The Americans were securing not only the surrender of Italian-based forces, but also the foundation of their post-war technological dominance. At the same time, Stalin bombarded Roosevelt and Churchill with telegrams accusing them of duplicity. On March 3, 1945, he warned of separate peace treachery undermining Allied unity. Roosevelt denied the charges, insisting the talks were preliminary and without substance. Yet British Foreign Office documents prove otherwise. Detailed minutes from Sunrise meetings exist, recording the terms under which Wolfe demanded immunity. In return for the surrender of German forces in Italy, Wolfe and selected SS officers were promised leniency, safe passage, or even quiet resettlement in Allied zones. The British, though uneasy, chose silence, unwilling to fracture relations with Washington in the war's final days. When the guns finally fell silent in Italy in early May 1945, the public story was triumph. Allied troops marched unopposed into Milan, Florence, and Turin, celebrated for sparing cities further destruction. Wolfe was briefly detained, later testifying at Nuremberg but ultimately escaping the noose. He lived until 1984, a free man, shielded from the fate of most of his peers. Why? The answer may lie in the missing Sunrise files. OSS records concerning the Bern negotiations were heavily redacted before release, with entire folders marked destroyed in 1950. British records show similar gaps, cross-referenced only with cryptic notations, special handling, Alpine talks. The shadows of Sunrise stretched into the Cold War. Several SS officers allegedly involved in the talks vanished from Allied custody. Years later, some surfaced in unexpected places. Intelligence advisors for NATO, military researchers in American laboratories, or unnamed consultants for aerospace corporations. Their sudden disappearance from war crimes rosters, followed by quiet integration into Western institutions, suggests deliberate absorption. These men, once architects of terror, became assets in the struggle against the Soviet Union. Sunrise had not only ended the war in Italy, it had laid groundwork for the post-war intelligence apparatus. For the Soviets, the betrayal was never forgotten. Declassified KGB files reference Sunrise repeatedly as proof of Western treachery, shaping Soviet distrust throughout the Cold War. For the Vatican, Sunrise was part of its own shadow diplomacy, protecting individuals whose survival it deemed strategically or morally justified. For the West, Sunrise was both a triumph and a stain, a surrender achieved at the price of compromise, where justice yielded to expedience. The unanswered questions remain haunting. What was in the crates moved under guard in Switzerland? Which names were struck from trial lists under American protection? How many of the men spared by Sunrise went on to shape post-war science, intelligence, and politics? And most unsettling, if secret bargains determined the fates of war criminals and scientific assets, how many other Sunrises remain buried, their files destroyed, their truths sealed behind classification stamps? The Alps, neutral and quiet, were the stage where war ended in one theatre and another began. The Cold War, born not from open battles, but from shadowed deals in smoke-filled rooms. History does not always end with victory parades, surrender ceremonies, or court verdicts. Sometimes it ends in silence, in pages torn from archives, in witnesses who vanish before they can testify. The Second World War left ruins across Europe and Asia, but it also left black holes in the record. Files marked destroyed, names erased from rolls, operations never acknowledged by governments sworn to transparency. The vanishing convoy of Operation Hannibal, the sealed vaults of Project Riese, the disappearing battalion in the Ardennes, and the shadow bargain of Operation Sunrise are not isolated anomalies. They are fragments of a hidden war that ran parallel to the one we read in history books. A war fought in secrecy with intelligence cables, coded transmissions, sealed crates, and whispered negotiations. Each mystery bleeds into the Cold War that followed, feeding suspicions, rivalries, and a culture of silence among nations that feared the truth would destabilize the fragile order they had constructed. What was hidden beneath Baltic waters, behind Owl Mountain Rock, in Soviet camps, or across Swiss tables was not merely evidence of atrocities, but evidence of collaboration, compromise, and the deliberate burial of history itself. The victors built their world on rubble, but also on secrets too dangerous to reveal. As long as archives remain sealed, as long as wrecks lie unrecovered beneath the sea, and as long as testimonies are withheld, the the shadows of these four mysteries will persist. Reminders that history is not just what was recorded, but also what was erased. The truth, still locked away, waits for its moment to resurface.